Hey guys, I'm Joe, and today we're finally here to talk about Spider-Man Homecoming, the latest edition in the MCU, and the second time that Spider-Man has been rebooted within a 15-year time frame. Directed by Jon Watts, starring Tom Holland, Michael Keaton, Marissa Tomei, and various other people. Basically telling the story of Peter Parker trying to go through high school life while also dealing with the threat of the Vulture that's shown up on the streets of Queens and trying to prove himself as a worthy addition to the Avengers to Tony Stark. And I feel like I can't really talk about this movie without going into details about the plot, so spoiler warning if you haven't seen Homecoming yet. It's been out for a couple days, but I've warned you. Now, if you guys have been following my series of Spider-Man reviews over the last few months, you know that I love the first two Spider-Man movies. Those two are near and dear to my heart. Spider-Man 3 was okay, disappointing. The Amazing Spider-Man films, go watch my reviews. But if you saw my Civil War review from last year, I really thought Tom Holland was a great choice for the character. And I still didn't want to say whether or not he was the best Spider-Man that we've seen on screen, because 2 scenes in one movie is not exactly fair to 5 feature films, or at least 3 in Tobey's case. And looking back on the whole franchise, even the most diehard Spider-Man fan can admit that this hasn't really been an easy ride. Especially with the marketing campaign for Homecoming. The trailers, some of them I thought were pretty good, like the first one. The second one, maybe a little too much was shown, but I didn't really pay attention to the marketing after a while. But I think a lot of people were blowing it out of proportion, saying that it was going to be the worst thing that they ever saw and they weren't even going to give it a chance because of Sony's involvement. But I walked into this movie on opening day really excited, but also really scared, because you guys know that Spider-Man means a lot to me. And I left the theater relieved. Spider-Man is back. Homecoming is really good. Now, I'm going to say right off the bat, is this the best Spider-Man movie that we've ever seen? I personally don't think so. But that's not to say that this isn't a good movie, because it actually has a character in Peter Parker that's likable and endearing and is not a jerk. And a villain that's actually not a villain for some stupid contrived reason. Something we haven't seen in a Spider-Man movie in a really long time. Let's start off with the main guy, Tom Holland. This kid is gold. He is terrific as Peter Parker. Like I said before, he's endearing, believably awkward, and funny without ever being too annoying. The short film of recording himself while he's in Berlin, chronicling the events leading up to the airport battle in Civil War, getting the suit, and during the battle, I was laughing so hard. This kid is so funny. And a lot of that has to do with his age, him being a teenager, because he doesn't really know any better. And this is a little bit more towards Civil War, but a child is a lot easier to convince to go into a fight like this than someone like Daredevil. And since Peter has a lot of stuff in common with Tony Stark as far as the science thing goes, obviously he would be really excited if Tony Stark made him an offer to join him on the Avengers Crusade. And he comes off very believable as a nerd. Not just in his look, but the way he acts with other people, like his friend Ned, played by somebody whose name I can't remember, I apologize, and how he's picked on by Flash Thompson and not really well respected by some of his peers, and how he wants to ask out this girl, Liz, in his class, who's part of the decathlon team that he's involved in. And speaking of the high school stuff, this movie actually explores much further into the high school life of Peter Parker, since it was briefly touched upon in the previous films, and it feels a lot like a John Hughes-inspired movie, recreated for today, since Jon Watts and the writers have said publicly, along with Kevin Feige, that they wanted to take a lot of ideas from John Hughes' classic films from the 80s. Breakfast Club's an inspiration with characters like Michelle, played by Zendaya, and there's a sequence where Spider-Man's running through the backyards of this neighborhood in Queens, very reminiscent of Ferris Bueller running through the backyards trying to beat his sister home to his house, and they play Ferris Bueller's Day Off in one of the yards that he runs through. And when it gets to the Spider-Man stuff, it's pretty entertaining, I would say. And I think he's really good as Spider-Man. He's heroic, but he's also funny in all the right ways. I was watching really closely to see, is he really being funny for the sake of being funny? But no, he was joking while simultaneously fighting his enemies, such as the ATM robbery scene that you saw in the trailers, and the ferry sequence. And in the ATM robbery scene, when one of those weapons starts going berserk and slices through that one bodega that Peter was at earlier, Spider-Man actually freaks out and runs over across the street to see if anybody was hurt in there, and he saves the store owner and the guy's cat. Bank robbers got away, but that's one of those moments where I'm like, yes, that is Spider-Man. He doesn't stick around for the sake of being funny. If he thinks that something went wrong and people are in danger, that's when it stops being funny and it's time to get down to business. Thank you. Sorry, Lost myself for a sec. Now, I mentioned the plot earlier. Well, he's basically trying to prove himself as an Avenger. This story isn't exactly the most complex story that I've seen, but I think in this movie it's okay because this is the second time it's being rebooted, the second after the Andrew Garfield series, so I think Marvel, along with Sony, had to tread really careful ground to not make any risks that were too big in my book, because I know some people, like with Force Awakens, which that's a whole nother story, but they wanted everything to be completely ballsy and original all at once while being very familiar. Originality does not necessarily equate to quality. Sometimes you gotta play things a little safe in order to get people back into the groove. And then when the sequels come around, then you can kind of go have the free reign and do whatever you want to, because if you go full-on originality in the first outing, there's a chance you could blow your load a little too quickly. And what's the point of even sticking around seeing more sequels? Which also, some people have complained that Uncle Ben's never mentioned out loud. Well, I would have liked to have had at least one out loud line where Peter says, where after Ned finds out Peter's secret, I would have liked to have seen Peter say, no, you cannot tell Aunt May, not after everything that's happened with Uncle Ben. His death is the reason why I do this. I'm okay with it, because I feel like had they did mention Uncle Ben, I guarantee you some of the fans would have been like, no, don't mention Uncle Ben ever again. I hate this movie. Never gonna please anybody, no matter what you do. It's not exactly referenced out loud, but they do certainly allude to it at least once or twice in this film. Just like they did in Civil War, where Peter says, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you. And I think eventually they will cover Uncle Ben later on in the series, because the 90s show started off without even mentioning Uncle Ben until like a few episodes in. So sometimes it's better to just jump right into the story, and then in the future you can let things flesh out and it makes the experience a little more richer. At least I think it does. And real quick, Mr. Feige, if you're somehow watching this, please, please, please ask Tobey Maguire if he wants to be a young Uncle Ben. Please, 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 please make this happen, please. Okay, anyway, we gotta move on. Now, since I mentioned Peter's friend Ned, this movie has a couple of different things in here that some of the other films didn't do. Peter has a friend who now knows a secret and is able to help him out in his superheroic endeavors. Some of the time, at least in this one. Now, Ned Leeds apparently in the comics is one of the hobgoblins. From the original comics, I remember him being the love interest of Betty Brant when Betty and Peter were dating at one point. And Betty Brant is in this movie, but very briefly played by Andrea Rice, if that's her name, from last year's The Nice Guys. And watching the trailers, I thought he was going to come off really annoying here, but to my surprise, he was actually really funny. I thought he was really funny. Maybe one or two times he was a little obnoxious. It's kind of like John Candy in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, where he's a lovable kind of nuisance. Another John Hughes reference, I get it. Well, yeah, it would have worked better had they not shown that in the trailers. I still thought it was a funny moment when Peter turns around and his friend's sitting there like this, and he drops that Lego Death Star and it splatters all over the floor. And Marissa Tomei is Aunt May. At first, I wasn't really that thrilled about her being Aunt May, and she's not in there for very long. She's only in here throughout the movie here and there, but what we do see, I was okay with it in this one. I think I can get on board with this one, but I don't want to say anything just yet because I would like to see more scenes with her and Peter. And again, I think Tobey Maguire playing a younger Uncle Ben would make more sense for Aunt May to be a lot younger, in this case at least, if you get what I mean. And I mentioned Peter Parker being really funny in here. There's a lot of funny moments in here that I thought were very funny, such as when Peter's trying to figure out the functions of his new suit that Tony gave him, the enhanced interrogation mode where he interrogates Donald Glover's character in the parking garage. No, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. Deactivate enhanced interrogation. You need to get better at this part of the job. What? Come on, I'm intimidating. And also the moment where Jennifer Connelly, as the voice of the AI in the suit, said, activating instant kill mode. No, I don't want to kill anybody. Suit lady, what was that? Those are taser webs. Taser webs? Now's your moment, Peter. Kiss her. I wonder if that was a reference to the upside down kiss in the first movie. It probably was. There's a lot of funny moments in here that I'd have to watch multiple times in order to pick up on them, but initially I was a little concerned since the writers, I can't remember their names, had written stuff like horrible bosses or other things that I'm forgetting off the top of my head. So I was a little worried that they would go too overboard with the comedy, but with Marvel's guidance in here, I think they actually found the right balance in this one. And Spider-Man doesn't come off as annoying in this one. And speaking of which, I was worried that Sony was going to get their hands in the pot so much and ruin this, but after reading a quote from Kevin Feige that he and the creative team at Marvel were making most of the decisions, and Sony was putting the final seal of approval, I don't really feel like this movie has any inconsistent narrative flaws to it. I think this movie feels very fluid, at least I think it does most of the time, and I'm really glad that Sony didn't put their hands in the pot so much, because even though there's a couple of things in the trailers that aren't in the final cut, such as the shot of Spider-Man and Iron Man flying towards the screen, I'm okay with that not being in there. It's a cool shot, but I don't really care if it's in there. But I'm really glad that Sony didn't screw this up, because I'm sure they know by now that they can't mess this up again, especially since they're in Marvel's universe. They gotta play their ball game. Otherwise, Marvel could just put their foot down and say, you know what, if that's the way you want to do it, we're not going to make these movies anymore. And real quick, the way I'm going on about this movie praising it, you can call me a blind MCU fanboy all you want, but really, I think this is actually a really good movie. I'm not saying it's without flaws, because there are some, and I'm going to address them, but really, I think this is probably the first good Spider-Man movie that we've had in quite a long time, and might be one of the best MCU flicks that we've ever gotten. You can call me a blind fanboy all you want, but that's how I feel. If you don't like this movie, okay, fine. It's alright by me. But don't get on my case about it just because I like this movie. Some of the things that I was a little iffy on was Flash Thompson, played by Tony Revolori. I don't know. Flash Thompson, as you know, is like the big confident jock in school that bullies Peter Parker. In the original film, he was played by Joe Manganiello. I bought him as a Flash Thompson kind of guy. He looks like the kind of guy who would pick on Tobey Maguire, a nerdy looking guy. This one, they make him a geek of some kind, for part of the decathlon team, like a rival nerd with Peter. I'm not really sure if I'm into that. I get it that they're going to change certain things when you adapt something from the comics, and I'm not one of those comic book purists who wants everything to look and feel exactly like the way it did originally, but I'm not really sure if this is the right move for Flash Thompson. In my book, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And Michelle, played by Zendaya, doesn't really have much character to her, but she does have her quirks though, such as, too late, you guys are losers. And Peter goes like this. I'm just here to draw people who are in crisis. What? She was very reminiscent of Allison Sheedy from The Breakfast Club, the quiet girl in the back who doesn't really say much until the very end. The one who goes like this. Very observant, as she calls herself. But then it turns out at the end, she reveals, when she's made the captain of the decathlon team, oh, by the way, my friends call me MJ. And when she said that, I literally went like this. What? I thought they said she wasn't Mary Jane. But as it turns out, she's not. Kevin Feige has come out and said, no, she's not MJ. It's just a reminder of that kind of relationship and where it could go in the future, because there's a little look that she gives after Peter gets up to leave to meet Happy Hogan. At least to me, it's pretty clear that she likes Peter. And I literally said as I watched it, she's into him? Okay, we'll see how it goes, I guess. Speaking of love interests, you also have Liz, played by Laura Harrier. Liz Allen was actually the first girl that Peter was crushing on in the original comics before Betty Brant and Gwen and MJ and so on. And I appreciated that they actually went for a love interest that was never really explored on film before. Now, if you know the comics or Spectacular Spider-Man, this character is actually pretty shallow and very prissy and uptight, like, oh, Peter, I'm so busy, I don't have time for your foolishness. I'm sorry, that was a very terrible popular girl impression. They don't portray the character that way in this film. She's very kind and kind of sweet, actually, and you kind of see why Peter's into her, obviously, besides being the popular girl, but she's clearly into Peter, and in the comics, she was kind of into Peter, but she was afraid to let that out in the open. This one is a little bit more explicit, and I appreciated that. And you see that Peter does want to be with her and wants to impress his friends, but he's also torn between that and doing what's right by fighting bad guys. Because there's quite a few moments in here where he knows that he wants to go in and impress his friends, but when he sees something in danger, he knows what's in his heart is right, and he goes out and he does the right thing. And I said, that's why we love you, Peter. That's why we love you. And as far as an action movie goes, the action is not the most memorable action that I've seen, especially after the first two Raimi films with the train sequence, the Times Square scene, and so on. Really, how are you going to live up to that stuff? And this movie doesn't really try to be that way, at least I don't think it does, but I think the action, while standard, is pretty enjoyable to watch in my book, especially the Staten Island ferry sequence. And if you're probably wondering, how do you know what that ferry's called? Well, my family's from New York City, and I've been to New York quite a few times, so I know a little bit about that city, and some of my relatives live on Staten Island. And it was nice to see a representation representation of the Staten Island ferry after The Dark Knight 9 years ago. It's where Spider-Man encounters the Vulture and his goons on the Staten Island ferry, and then it splits open after Vulture or one of his goons fires one of their weapons and splits the ship in half, and he's pulling all these webs together, trying to pull it together, just like Spider-Man did on the train in Spider-Man 2, but then Iron Man comes in and saves the day, and he takes away the suit because Peter was acting irresponsibly. And speaking of which, a lot of people were afraid that Tony Stark was going to take up a big chunk of this film, that it was going to be Iron Man 4. He's only in there sparingly, and I appreciated that. And when the scenes between him and Peter are there, I would have liked a little bit more of that, to be honest, but I think it was pretty good from what we saw, and I like that dynamic, personally. Not just because of the common interest in science, but they're both kind of snarky guys in some ways, so I liked that stuff. And I also really like the stuff that they did with Happy Hogan. And Jon Favreau's really funny. I really like seeing that guy in these movies. Put on the suit, kid. Take it off. Who is this? Mr. Hogan? It's Peter's friend. You gotta be kidding me. And the bathroom scene at the end. Oh, God. That was great. And there's a couple Easter eggs, as you'd expect from a comic book movie, of villains or certain characters that may be played on in the future. Like Donald Glover's character says that he's got a nephew in Queens. Apparently his character is the Prowler in the comics, who was Miles Morales' uncle. If you know Miles Morales, he takes over Peter Parker when Peter Parker dies in Ultimate Spider-Man comics. So I can see them possibly going the Miles Morales route, but later on down the line, because we want to get into Peter Parker first before we can go in that direction. So hopefully Marvel doesn't go that way anytime soon, at least not too quickly, and I don't think they will. But then you also got guys like the Tinkerer from the original comics, and I don't really know that much about him. I remember seeing some of him in the original comics, but I was never really a big fan of him from what I remember. I don't know. Then you got the Shocker, which I first remember the Shocker from the Spider-Man movie video game from '02. I always liked that Shocker in that video game. I like that voice especially. You guys remember that voice?
When he gets down here, ambush him. There's no way we're giving up a score this big to some clown in red tights.
But he's only in the movie very briefly, and we don't see the classic costume, which apparently was on the merchandising for this film. The most reminiscent appearance of the Shocker that we see, besides the shock gauntlets, are the yellow sleeves with the square patterns on them. Not that that really matters or anything, but I would have liked to have seen the full costume, but that's just a huge nitpick. And Scorpion is in here. Like, when I first noticed it, some people noticed the Scorpion tattoo on the guy's neck. I didn't notice that. When I heard the name Mac Gargan, I freaked out. I thought, oh my god, Scorpion! Scorpion! And I would like to see Scorpion show up later on down the line, especially with his connection with Jonah Jameson, which they have to bring J.K. Simmons back. Please bring him back. And I hope they don't make him just this one-note goon like he comes off in this one. Hopefully they'll go the direction that eventually happens to him later on. Now, speaking of villains, let's talk about Michael Keaton as the Vulture, aka Adrian Toomes. The Vulture was the second villain that Spider-Man fought in the early comics after the Chameleon. If you know who the Vulture is, he's a guy who flies around in vulture wings or a vulture outfit with a fur lining around his coat. And the Vulture, I think, is a pretty entertaining villain, but most of the time Spider-Man's bad guys are just one-note henchmen who want to steal things, which is kind of what the Vulture is in the comics anyway. This one, they actually give him a backstory where he was one of the construction workers that was picking up the scraps in Grand Central Station after Loki's army attacked New York City. And when Tony Stark's organization comes in with the cleanup, costing Adrian Toomes' job and the jobs of his crew, he decides to form this little crime ring and steal that stuff back from Tony Stark's organization. I was a little worried about the Vulture. From what I saw in the trailers, I was not really liking what I was seeing from the Vulture, and certain people, I won't say who, but they wanted him to look exactly like the comics. They didn't like the helmet and the mechanical wings that he was using. I was not really a big fan of that, but in the movie, I thought it was okay. Not the best. Yeah, it would have been cool to get the original look, but again, sometimes things from the comics don't equate to quality. I'm sorry. But the biggest surprise for me is when he actually turns out to be the father of Liz, the girl that Peter's crushing on. When Peter goes up to Liz's house and the front door opens and you see Michael Keaton standing there in the door, I literally went, what the f? And Peter is freaking out, like, what the hell is this guy doing here? And it turns out he's her father, and it's a really funny moment where he gives Liz the corsage or whatever it's called. He's like, is that a corsage? And he goes like this. And I also really liked how he figures out that Peter's Spider-Man, because as he's driving her and Peter to the homecoming dance, Liz and Peter are talking about how Spider-Man was around and how Peter's met Spider-Man through the Stark internship. Oh yeah, you were there? Oh yeah, and Spider-Man shows up randomly and all that stuff, and as this is happening, Adrian Toomes is going like this. I think anyone with a brain would be able to figure that stuff out. It kind of puzzles me, though. How come people don't put two and two together? Peter Parker disappears and then Spider-Man shows up. What does 2 plus 2 equal? They don't try to address it in the previous movies, so most of the times I can let it slide, but in this one, I think was actually done really well. And it's a really tense scene, and Michael Keaton actually sells the heck out of this. He's very intimidating, especially when he turns around. He goes, "Don't mess with me. I will kill you and everyone that you love." And that's another thing that I like, that they did stay true in some way to what the original comics were about. Most of the villains don't really have a stupid reason for hating Spider-Man, except Spider-Man keeps getting in their business one too many times. And they get so fed up with him that they eventually decide, I gotta get rid of this guy. There's no way I can get all this stuff done as long as he's out there. I gotta stop him. He tells him, stay out of my business. Go in there, have a good time with my daughter. Not too good of a time, but stay out of my way. Oh yeah, and another thing I forgot to mention, as far as the action, the sequence on the Washington Monument, that I think was actually kind of cool, and it reminded me of Mission Impossible 4, where Ethan is on the side of the Burj Khalifa, Peter's on the Washington Monument, and I got a little thing with heights. They're not my best friends. I got other phobias, but heights kind of freak me out a little bit, and when Karen, or Suit Lady, as he calls her initially, is like, Peter, what's wrong? I've never climbed anything this high before. And then when he leaps in the air over the helicopter and swings down below it through the window. It's not the best action sequence ever, but I think it actually is really cool in the fact that he's climbing something really tall, and he's never climbed anything that tall before, where you feel like you're actually learning with him as he's further growing as a superhero. And at this point, after he's discovered the Vulture's secret, Tony has taken the suit away from Spider-Man. He's back to his homemade suit. And it was actually a pretty heart-wrenching scene, seeing that Peter got the suit taken away from Tony Stark, and feeling like he failed to prove himself as an Avenger. Now, I know what some people are going to say. I don't like how Tony Stark gave him the suit. I like that Peter made the suit himself. Okay, I'm going to say this again. I probably said it before in my Civil War review, but I'm going to say this again. I get that complaint, but really, if he's a dirt poor high schooler, how do you explain someone in Peter's position will be able to create something this sophisticated? It doesn't make sense. There's no way he'd be able to afford that stuff. So I appreciate that he got a high quality suit from someone who can afford to make something like that. And just because he doesn't make the suit himself doesn't make him the most stupid person on the planet, okay? So Peter decides to take on the Vulture on his own, leaves Liz at the homecoming dance. Pretty low thing to do, but I get why Peter did it, because he felt like he had to stop her dad. And after he has a little talk with Adrian Toomes, who's going on about how the rich take everything from the people in the middle class or lower class and so on, and the whole building collapses onto him, and Peter's scared that he's not going to be able to get out of this alive, and he sees his reflection on the small puddle on the floor. If you're nothing without the suit, then you shouldn't have it. Then he feels like, you know what? I do have what it takes. And he pushes himself out and he swings after the Vulture. And hearing Peter getting scared in that moment, it's another example of why Tom Holland is a good choice, because he really makes it believable in this one. Now, real quick, some of you are probably going to wonder, do I like Tom Holland better, or do I like Tobey Maguire better, or do I like them both? I'll be honest with you guys, a huge part of me is always going to have Tobey Maguire as the Spider-Man. But you know what? Those who are saying that Tom Holland blows all the others out of the water and so on, who's to say you can't have a place for both? Tobey Maguire may be more timid and serious. He's more reminiscent in my eyes as the classic Peter Parker with a modern twist to him, or as modern was in the early 2000s. Similar thing with Tom Holland here. He's more inspired by the Ultimate Spider-Man and Spectacular Spider-Man with a bit of a modern twist to him as well. So personally, there's nothing wrong with having a place for both Tom or Tobey in my book. So I know it's got to be one or the other for some people, but where I stand, what's wrong with having both? I don't think there's anything wrong with it. So Spider-Man chases after the Vulture on the plane that takes off from Avengers Tower. They fight it out, and eventually they crash on the Coney Island beach, and the Vulture is saved by Spider-Man, and he's eventually arrested by the cops, and he's imprisoned. And it's another thing I appreciated, because Marvel villains haven't exactly been the best lately. They've been just like evil guys who are doing stuff for the sake of being evil. And another thing I think Marvel has really done a bad job of is that they kill off their villains a lot of the times pretty quickly, and the fun of that is actually having them come back for another round so that possibly you could get more character depth to them. So I'm really glad that they didn't do that this time around. They actually had Adrian Toomes arrested, and then in the mid-credit scene, they show that he could possibly come back and get back at Spider-Man. When he talks with Gargan, if I knew who he was, he'd already be dead. Which made me wonder, are they possibly going to lead to a Sinister Six movie, but appropriately? I think they could. So we'll see what happens. And after that, Tony Stark calls Peter to the new Avengers headquarters, and he offers him a place on the team. But then Peter has a moment after looking at the suit, which I'm assuming was a nod to Iron Spider of some kind, whatever that's called. He decides, you know what, Mr. Stark? I think I'm okay for now. I'll stay on the ground for a while. Isn't that what you wanted? And then he leaves and Pepper Potts shows up, saying, where's the kid? We gotta come up with something. Oh yeah, how about this? A wedding ring? Tony Stark. Oh yeah, and real quick, speaking of that, most of the MCU stuff I was fine with, like Captain America showing up on those videos that the teachers would show, but some of it kind of feels like an added-on addition, like Pepper Potts showing up at the end, so I guess Gwyneth Paltrow's still involved with the MCU in some way? I don't know. Most of the time it's fine, but sometimes it doesn't exactly work in the film's favor, I'm just saying. But Peter goes home, and he finds a package for him in his bedroom, and he opens it, and it's the suit that he was given to him initially by Tony, and saying, hey, this belongs to you. He puts it on, he feels very proud, and the camera slowly pans to the right, and in the doorway, you see Aunt May. She sees him in the Spider-Man suit, and she goes, what the? And then it ends. And I mentioned the mid-credits scene earlier, but the post-credits scene, which in the MCU, usually it's a joke. This one is like, hi, I'm Captain America. So you waited and waited, but then it turns out it's disappointing. How many more of these? I love Chris Evans. All in all, despite some of my flaws with the movie here and there, I actually think that this is a really, really good Spider-Man movie, and the first good Spider-Man movie that we've gotten since 2004, 13 years ago, and that is saying something. Personally, the first two are always going to be my favorite Spider-Man films, and I still think they will rank as the best, especially the second one, but I think this is definitely up there with those two personally. You want to call me a blind MCU fanboy? You go right ahead. And I am looking forward to seeing where else the character goes in this universe. I would like to see the Green Goblin eventually show up later down the line, and other characters like Harry Osborn and maybe Mary Jane. We'll see what happens. But for now, I'm okay with them using new characters and allowing us to absorb them, and then maybe we can bring back the familiar stuff. So, I would like to know what your thoughts are on Spider-Man Homecoming. Do you love it? Like it? Think it's alright? Do you not like it, or do you hate it? Whatever the case is, I'm prepared, so comment below and tell me what you thought of it, and I will see you guys next time.